Hello and welcome to another edition of Press Pass on GNet TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV's News Project. It's my pleasure to be your host today and great to have you with us. Today is Thursday, October 19th, and it's also great to have with us two other journalists here at the table. Pleased to welcome back Cherise Madigan, who's a reporter for the Manchester Journal and Bennington Banner, and to welcome for the first time on Press Pass, Sean Cunningham, who is a reporter for the Chester Telegraph, based in Chester, Vermont. Great to have you both with us.
Nice to be here.
Sean, let's get started and have you tell us a little bit about the Telegraph. It's an online-only news organization.
Online only. We're finishing our sixth year, and we've been reporting the news of Chester, Andover, Grafton, Weston, Londonderry, Wyndham. I'm forgetting someone, but and it's been an interesting ride. We've had enormous growth in readership, and people seem to really like getting news. So it's been good. It's sort of bucking the trend of newspapers getting smaller and smaller.
Right. So you aren't burdened by those quote unquote legacy costs of having to run a printing press and print a paper.
Our slogan is all news, no paper.
Okay. That's great. And what is the circulation there?
In terms of circulation, it's more. We look at it more as page views, and this year we're on track for somewhere between 500,000 and 525,000 page views.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. Clearly I'm dating myself here by using terms like circulation. How 20th century. Anyway, well, the big news, I guess, out of the mountain towns area that you folks cover up there was the announcement by Oliver Olson, the representative for the district that includes, let's see, Weston, Londonderry, Stratton, Jamaica,
Winhall.
And Winhall. I always seem to forget one of them.
Don't forget Winhall.
It's the only district, I think, in the state that covers 3 different counties altogether. Oliver announced that he was going to be stepping down from the legislature, I think, last Sunday, which was something that caught me by surprise. He just won re-election last year, having come back to the legislature in 2014 after a 2-year hiatus, and clearly, I think, could have easily won re-election again. Was it a surprise to you folks up there?
It was a surprise to me, but when I called Oliver on Monday morning, he said it shouldn't be. He said he's been sort of putting out feelers for a long time, looking for someone to come in and take over. He's doing very well with his business. He works in software, and he's traveling a lot, and he doesn't feel as though logistically he has the time this year to put toward the session, and he felt that the best thing to do for the community was to step aside. He's a terrific legislator. He's got a really good handle on legislative process, and he does a great job. But he's got it's not a full-time job.
Right, and I understand that job in the computer software industry is a very demanding one, involving a lot of travel as well. So I gather the Londonderry town clerk has indicated an interest in perhaps being the next representative to be appointed to fill out the remainder of Oliver's term.
And I think she's a good candidate. Kelly Payala is her name. She's, as you said, town clerk, assistant town treasurer. She's on the Parks Commission. She's got a couple of kids in the schools, and I think she's a very solid candidate to do that. The governor asked yesterday for applications for candidates for that post. I don't know how many he'll get between now and November 10th, but it can only be independents. So
yeah, that's an interesting situation because Oliver originally ran as a Republican back in 2010. I think it was the first time he ran for his own right. He filled out the expired year on his predecessor Rick Kuby's seat that year, and then won election in his own right, but as a Republican. But then when he returned in 2014, it was as an independent. So we'll see how many independents there are lurking about that might have visions for going to Montpelier.
Or how many suddenly become independent.
Right. Yeah. It's fungible, isn't it? Well, anyway, that'll be an interesting story to follow, and again, one that certainly came as a surprise to me. But anyway, that's what keeps it all interesting, I guess. Well, Cherise, let's pivot down the mountain and back to Manchester. Last week was dominated, I think it's fair to say, for both of us, I think, for covering the ITV Fest, the Independent Television Festival that came to town and kind of took over things for about 5 days and finally concluded last Sunday with the big gala reception awards night at the Southern Vermont Arts Center, Shades of Oscars, I guess.
Yep.
And tell us about that. You covered that extensively for the Journal, wrote a series of stories about it. What do you think were the big takeaways from it all?
It was quite the weekend, a lot of glitz and glamour for sure. It was really awesome though to see our town filled up with so many vivacious people. I mean, I think Phil Gilpin said that there was close to 1,500 industry insiders, content creators, everything from directors to producers, and then executives as well coming into town and enjoying our community. So I think there's a lot to be said about the festival, but for us here, the big takeaway is that it brought a lot of commerce to our area for 5 straight days. And from what I've heard, commerce was up, business was up, and it also attracted a lot of people to our community that might come back to visit or to even live and to work. And that's a big part of our town goals, is to not only increase tourism, which is a goal of the Business Association as well, but to attract more either primary residents or second homeowners, especially younger individuals and families who can live and work in this area. So I think the festival is a way to do that, and hopefully we see it continue.
And it sounds like it must have been successful from their standpoint, because I gather they've announced that they're going to come back for another festival next year.
Yes, Phil said that he felt very at home and welcomed in Manchester, which is great because this was the 12th year of the festival. I think they had been in Dover for the last 5 and said that the arts community there was great, but maybe not as well suited as Manchester is to the festival. So there was a lot of business owners who held special events, extended their hours, worked with the festival quite extensively, and the people that came apparently said that they just felt so embraced by the Manchester community that they wanted to keep coming back. So it'll be great, and hopefully they'll be working with Burn Burton for some year-round educational initiatives too with their top-of-the-line cinematography program. So it'll be a really cool partnership, I think.
This works its way up the mountain a little bit, up to Weston, I think. Also, there are a few events there.
Some of the
as
folks
well.
came up to the new facility at Walker Farm, the Weston Playhouse built, just opened up the week of October 5th or 1st. And we're bowled over by it. It's a state-of-the-art black box theater facility, and they loved it. We actually had an opportunity to go and see a show there, and the sound was incredible, the lighting was incredible, everything was beautifully done. So it's something that would perhaps add to this scene.
Further expansion.
Yeah.
One of the interesting sort of lines of conversation I kept on hearing about was whether or not the movie industry or the television business would now find Vermont a receptive place to do more production work. And towards that end, I guess a new entity called the Vermont Production Council has been formed to try and encourage content creators to think about coming to Vermont instead of going out to California or someplace else where they might ordinarily go. I know you wrote a story about them. We had Carolyn Blitz and Phil Gilpin on here a couple of weeks before the festival, and they were talking a little bit about this. Where do you see this going? Is this like a thing where we're going to be trying to get the state to offer them tax credits or some other kind of incentives to do work here?
Well, I've heard that tax credits are really highly incentivizing, so I don't think that would be a bad option. And I know that they're working with the government in Montpelier, but also with the local government here in Manchester. I think they've been talking to Brian Keefe. So that could be something that comes out of this. But in the first place, Vermont is financially, apparently, somewhere that's very attractive to the film industry. They made a short film called The Land as kind of a proof of concept of that. And Phil Gilpin was saying that it would cost close to $100,000 to film something of that size and length in either New York or LA. But they filmed it in Vermont, actually, in this area, and it cost only around $40,000. I say only, but comparatively, that's quite a savings. So if that works out and more films are attracted by that and more productions, I think that could be great for our local economy. You've got them using a lot of local cast and crew, especially local food vendors and everything, from electricians and carpenters for their sets. And the local settings are pretty hard to beat in Vermont, at least in my opinion. So.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see if that plays out. Certainly would be an interesting add-on to retail and some of the other industries that have been sort of the mainstays of the area's economy. Well, there was another story that emerged from Londonderry in the last couple of weeks, which both of you did stories on. It's quite interesting, kind of sticking with an art theme in a way. This public mural in Londonderry seems to have drawn a certain amount of controversy. I guess a local restaurant owner decided that the mural that had been painted several years ago by students from Floodbrook School had faded a little bit, or something was amiss, and came and painted it over without, I guess, asking anybody, and hot water ensued. Sean, what's the background, and where do we go from here?
This has been a huge story since, I think the first thing we did on it was September 15th, and it's just continued on and on and on. There's a wall near the turn to Weston that's a retaining wall, and a few years back they had decided to put a mural on it, and kids from Floodbrook made stencils, and then a mural artist basically painted those onto that wall. They didn't want the kids out on the highway painting, and it's been there for a number of years. It had begun to deteriorate, and the artist, Garrison Buxton, was going to come back this fall and do some touching up. And before he did, Ed Brown, the owner of the Mill Tavern, got a bucket of concrete stain and painted it dark green.
And this was without any permission or
Nope.
seeking approval from the select board, or
And
talking to the art
actually,
teacher?
the select board okayed it, but it actually belongs to VTrans. So it's state property. So that's part of the brouhaha.
Okay. So what's going to happen? Is he going to be charged with anything? Or?
He has been charged.
Okay.
He's been charged with unlawful mischief, and depending on the value of the mischief, is the penalties for it. It appears to be high enough that it's a felony. So he's being arraigned on the 7th in court, and we'll see what happens.
Never a dull moment in Londonderry, it seems. But anyway, Sharice, I wanted to also follow up a little bit. You had talked about this in a bit. We were discussing the ITV Fest, but I see the Journal is attempting to kind of pin down a little bit how much business there was for foliage this season. Has there been any responses from some of the businesses yet about how much business they got this year?
Well, the responses I've gotten have been mostly focused on the ITV Fest, because I think that's just so fresh in people's minds right now.
Right.
But I do hope that I hear more, and anybody watching this, please send me your comments. Mostly because our local economy is such a big issue in Manchester. It's the life and blood for so many people, and it's a big goal of not just the town government to stimulate our economy and keep it booming, but also the Business Association. So while I'm reporting from those two larger entities, I'd really love to hear from the actual business owners and share their stories as well, and see what their struggles are or where their strengths are in terms of business in Manchester, and open up more of a community dialogue on how we can continue to keep that strong.
It'll probably have already happened by the time most folks have a chance to watch this show, but next Tuesday, October 22nd, if I'm doing my math right, the Business Association is going before the Select Board, the Manchester Select Board, to kind of seek some additional support, possibly getting some additional money from the local option tax. It'll be interesting to hear kind of exactly how much extra business that ITV has brought, as well as just the standard state of things, because of course the big change for, and this is not a new story, is the whole competition between the bricks and mortar businesses on Main Street and Depot Street and the online world like Amazon and other e-tailers. And I wonder if they're going to figure out a way to kind of break that down, to kind of find out what the difference is. Because I think, isn't there a new regulation going in this year where they have to separate, the online sales now have to be reported? And it may well be that we'll have an interesting breakout of how much money comes from online sales versus, the traditional businesses.
Yeah.
So it'll be fun to see how that plays out. But
How did foliage go here? Because up on the mountain it was dull, and then suddenly it was brilliant, and now it's gone. And it didn't have legs. Did you have a long season here?
Yeah, it wasn't as spectacular as it's been in the past,
Yeah.
but we did have kind of that quick uptick, and luckily I think it's been a little warmer down here than it has been up in the mountains, so we've held on to it a little longer.
Yeah.
But I think we hit peak and ITV Fest right around the same weekend, so couldn't have asked for better PR for the town.
yeah, it did seem to get off to a bit of a slow start, and then
It
had
did.
that one really busy week, and then boom, over, done. But at least if from my sort of anecdotal observations of how many cars are going by, that's basically the. It'd be
may
great to get
stop on the
better
side of the
data
road.
about that kind of stuff than just a pair of eyeballs, thinking, or counting the number of out-of-state license plates or whatever. I remember that was one technique that one person did many, many years ago. Well, we have a bunch of other bits of news that have been coming up in the last couple of weeks. But one of them is around that sort of hardy perennial of Act 46 and the school district mergers. Both of you have interesting mergers underway in your various districts, one Rupert and Paulet, and one in Mount Holly and Ludlow, both of which I guess got approved yesterday by the State Board of Education at their monthly meeting. So let's talk about that a little bit. Rupert and Paulet, when you start there, interesting story because they're I think the only two school districts in the state that used to anyway designate to New York State schools. And that, I guess, was the big issue the first time around.
Yes. Well, their plan, they had brought an original merger study proposal to the state, I believe, in mid-September. And when they went there, that was unfortunately rejected by the state because they were afraid that there was too much inequity involved. So while they were designating two New York schools in Salem and Granville, parents who wanted to send their children to independent schools or private schools here in Manchester, like Long Trail or Burr and Burton, would have to pay the Vermont state average tuition rather than a larger percentage having been provided for them. So they were afraid that if a parent could afford to send their children to an independent school, then they would do so. And if they couldn't, they would be kind of forced to send them to Salem or Granville. Not that that's such a bad fate either, but they're afraid that there was some inherent inequity there. So that was rejected with a lot of, I don't want to use the term lobbying, but that was the term used at the meeting from this organization of parents in Paulet and Rupert who were concerned about that very thing and wanted to have the option to send their children wherever they want. They want to have school choice remain the norm. So I think the merger that passed is the merger of the two districts, and then choice will be the norm for 7 through 12 at this point, and there'll be a vote on the 21st. On
Right. 21st of November, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course that new school board that will be formed out of that merger could decide, well, no, we like designation. And because of the huge tax implications, I mean, it's much less expensive for them to send the kids to Salem and Granville as opposed to sending them to Vermont, which is kind of another interesting question there too.
Yes.
I guess those two school districts are heavily subsidized by New York State taxpayers from elsewhere, and that resulted in really low tax rates in Rupert and Paulet, which
kind of
course,
artificially low.
hard to dislike that, I guess, but going to be an interesting story. So, meanwhile, up in your neck of the woods there, Mount Holly and Ludlow have another Act 46 proposal, which I guess involves the town of Marlborough somehow figured into this.
No.
No? I thought that was the original proposal. Marlborough was going to be in it, but they
I have not seen anything about that. The originally, they still are. Mount Holly and Ludlow are part of the Two Rivers Supervisory Union, along with Chester, Andover, Cavendish, and Baltimore. And when they first began, what they were trying to do was come to a merger with all of those, but because of the rules, one of the high schools would have had to have closed, and Black River, being the smaller one, was slated or was looking at that. And it went round and round and round, and realizing that that schools, a group of the schools could get together and preserve their Act 46 incentives, they went ahead and formed the Green Mountain Union School District, which was voted in this past year. In the meantime, Ludlow and Mount Holly decided to try merging with Mill River. And it's a good long distance from Ludlow to Mill River.
That's in Wallingford.
Yeah, and so, and people didn't want to close Black River, so that got voted down, and then they were in an even tighter spot. And over the course of a number of meetings and haggling and that sort of thing, they finally came to the conclusion that what they would do is to start off a side-by-side where you have two elementary schools and a high school, but they would phase out the high school, close it, and then tuition all the 7 through 12 students to whatever schools in the area. And that's what's passed at the Board of Education level yesterday and will be voted on November 28th.
Interesting stuff.
And-
Because now we're getting down to the deadline here. If they don't
and-
have those mergers proposals now, they don't get those tax incentives that are pretty attractive.
And the schools, and that's, now we're getting down to the point where schools are closing.
Yeah, yeah. Where the State Board of Ed will start saying, okay, school districts and supervisory unions, this is what you're going to do, as opposed to the locals figuring it out.
Right,
So the rubber is going to meet the road, I think, fairly soon.
indeed.
We have a few minutes left, Sean, and I know you wanted to talk about this Chester town plan or master plan that's in the works.
Chester has been working with a group in Burlington, SE Group, for about a year, putting together a Village Center master plan. And the Village Center master plan came up with a large menu of things that could possibly be done. And they're beginning to roll those out. They're doing presentations tonight and Sunday. And those presentations will be explaining to people, what could happen. But even before those presentations, the town received an $800,000 bicycle pedestrian grant from VTrans. And so it's a federal grant, so it takes a while to put all the ducks in a row, but probably in about 3 years, they'll be putting a sidewalk from City Hall, or from Town Hall, about 2/3 of the way over to the Village Green, and doing a number of things like putting in pedestrian scale lighting and a lot of things that will make it a very attractive walk. And then there are other things that are parklets. They're going to be putting in a small park at the end. If anyone knows Chester, there's a little suspension bridge that goes across the Williams River, and a small park at the end of one end of the bridge, and then at the other end of the bridge, a way to get down to the river, river access. So there's a number of these things that are going on, and they'll make the town a pretty attractive place to visit. And just, it really sort of ramps everything up. There's a lot of interesting things going on.
It sounds awfully similar to some of the ideas happening in Manchester too, with the Depot Street reconfiguration that's supposed to start, I think, next year, and some of the other initiatives that came out of that planning conference that was held here last month. Similar stuff, bike paths and...
There's not related to the
Federal.
master planning, but there's also a push by the New England Forestry Foundation to buy 1,800 acres of land, 5% of Chester, and put it in protection and open it to the public for hiking and biking and hunting and fishing and all sorts of other things, snowmobiling.
Oh.
So,
Yeah, big doings in Chester. And I know there's one more hugely important item that
absolutely.
you
Green Mountain Union High
need to talk
School
about.
girls soccer team, as of today, is 13-0. They play their last game tomorrow night at Bellows Falls, and playoffs start next week.
Has it ever happened before? Is this an
They've had
undefeated season?
very good girls soccer teams in the past, but it's always nice to see one that goes this far.
Okay. Well, I mean, and that takes priority. That's probably the most important thing we've talked about all afternoon. Anyway, well, thank you both for being with us again today for another edition of the show, and great to have you both with us. And we'll have to have to drag you down off the mountain again at some point, Sean.
It's a pleasure.
And thank all of you for being with us as well. It's been a pleasure to have you tuning in, and we'll see you again the next time. And meanwhile, have a great day.